Ladies and gentlemen, namaskar. Welcome to the 16th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India at the front lawn. It's a beautiful Sunday morning, and we are delighted to introduce the first session for today, Russia, Revolution and Civil War, Antony Beevor and Luke Harding in conversation with Simon Sebag Montefiore. Between 1917 and 1921, a devastating struggle took place in Russia, following the collapse of the Tsarist Empire. Many regard this savage civil war as the most influential event of the modern era. Terror begat terror, which in turn led to even greater cruelty, with man's inhumanity to man, woman, and child. The struggle became a world war by proxy, as Churchill deployed weaponry and troops from the British Empire, while armed forces from the United States, France, Italy, Japan, Poland, and Czechoslovakia played rival parts. Using the most up-to-date scholarship and archival research, Antony Beevor, author of the acclaimed international bestseller Stalingrad, assembles the complete picture in a gripping narrative that conveys the conflict through the eyes of everyone, from the worker on the streets of Petrograd to the cavalry officer on the battlefield and the woman doctor in an impoverished hospital. Journalist Luke Harding's books include Invasion, the inside story of Russia's bloody war and Ukraine's fight for survival, and The Shadow State, Murder, Mayhem, and Russia's Remaking of the West, among others. In conversation with the best-selling writer and historian Simon Sebag Montefiore, Beevor and Harding examine Russia, the years of revolution and civil war. I'm delighted to introduce the first speaker for today, Antony Beevor. Is the author of Stalingrad, Berlin, D-Day, and the Second World War. His work, which has received major prizes in this country and abroad, has appeared in 35 languages and sold more than 8.5 million copies. He was knighted in 2017. Welcome. The second speaker for today is Luke Harding. He's a journalist, writer, and award-winning correspondent for The Guardian. He's a former Moscow bureau chief and reported from Delhi between 2000 and 2003. Harding is the author of numerous books, including Invasion, the inside story of Russia's bloody war and Ukraine's fight for survival, published in November by Faber in London and Vintage in New York. And the moderator for today's session is none other than Simon Sebag Montefiore. He's the internationally best-selling author of prize-winning books that have been published in 48 languages. Catherine the Great and Potemkin were shortlisted for the Samuel Johnson Prize. Stalin, the Court of the Red Tsar, won the History Book of the Year Prize and the British Book Award. Young Stalin won the Costa Prize and the LA Times Biography Prize. Jerusalem won the Wenchun Prize in People's Republic of China and the JBC Book of the Year Prize in the United States. The Romanovs won the Lupicia Prize in Italy. His latest is The World, A Family History. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Antony Beevor, Luke Harding, and Simon Sebag Montefiore, Russia, Revolution, and Civil War.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's wonderful to be back here on the main stage in Jaipur. Thanks for joining us. And we've got a pretty fascinating session for you today. Our mothership is going to be Antony Beevor's masterful new book, Russia, Revolution, and Civil War. But we also have Luke Harding here, who's been reporting from Ukraine, who's a historian of now, we can say, who's covered the degradation of the Russian state in the 21st century. And I've written The Romanovs about the creation of the Russian Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries. So we are going to cover the whole Russian Civil War, which was one of the most significant events that formed the 20th century and the events of the 21st century. Over 10 million people died in this terrible conflict. And I'm going to go straight to Antony. And to start with, Antony, why did you choose this subject? You've done Stalingrad, you've done Berlin, both astonishing world bestsellers. Why did you choose to do the Russian Civil War, and why now?
Well, originally, I wanted to do it 30 years ago. Fortunately, my publishers at the time said, you're crazy, and they were quite right. A, the Russian archives were not open at that and B, as a historian, I simply wasn't ready for it. I didn't have the experience. So I'm very grateful they stopped me. The reason why it was so important, of course, was that I think all historians who've written about the First World War and describe it as the original catastrophe of the 20th century are absolutely right. The reason why the Russian Civil War was so important was because of its influence afterwards. The horrors, the destruction, the vicious circle of fear that it created across Europe and the world produced, A, the split between left and right, between red and white, between fascism and communism. But it produced, as I say, this circle of fear which led to the Spanish Civil War and then on to the Second World War. So this is why it was such an influential conflict.
I think it also created the brutalization of the Soviet state, which has had such implications today, which brings me to Ukraine. The war was fought on many, many fronts, as Antony will tell us soon, and we're not only going to dwell in Ukraine, because we have a session tonight, me and Luke, which we will be talking only about Ukraine. So we're going to be talking today about Georgia, about the Baltics, about the Mongolian front. But, of course, the great battlefield of the Russian Civil War was Ukraine. And Luke, tell us, what is the feeling today, at the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the link with that civil war?
Yes, actually, I was in Kiev on February the 23rd of last year, 2022, just hours before the full-scale Russian invasion, having dinner with a wonderful Ukrainian novelist called Andrei Kurkov. And it did actually feel like a sort of moment freighted with history, because Kurkov at that point was working on a novel set in the Civil War, set in the sort of tumultuous period after 1917, and he was showing around the dinner table, along with, we were eating Ukrainian soup, drinking honey vodka, and he'd been given secret police files from the Bolsheviks, who, when they swept into Kiev, began rounding up various people, the bourgeoisie, white officers, and so on. And it was hard not to feel, actually, we're talking about February of last year, that a century after those events that Antony writes about so brilliantly and so well, history was repeating. In other words, with a kind of Moscow army at the gates coming to crush Ukrainian independence. I mean, the Ukraine had just become sort of briefly independent at that point, very, very short-lived. There does seem to be a cycle, Simon and Antony. I don't know if you see it like that, but that's certainly how it felt on the ground.
That's fascinating. So now I want to go back to the war itself. Those of you who know Russian history will know that the Russian Empire had conquered bit by bit many peoples. Lenin called it the prison of nations. Antony, is it the right way to see the Russian Civil War partly as a reconquest of the Russian Empire?
Well, it certainly turned into that particular idea. What's interesting is the way that Putin criticized Lenin for the independence of Ukraine, which is absolute rubbish. What's interesting is the way that it was Lenin's attempt to avoid the idea of Russian chauvinism, that in the end of 1917 he gave the idea of self-determination. Now, the Ukrainians were far too weak to be able to take advantage of it. But the Finns grabbed the opportunity, and this is why Finland achieved its independence in its own civil war at the beginning of in the early part of 1918. So we see already this struggle between the former components of the Tsarist Empire and the nascent Soviet Union trying to grab back the elements of the old empire.
And of course, Poland also. Poland and Finland
Very much so.
grabbed independence. The Baltics achieved it for a short time, and Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia lost it pretty quickly. But I'm just going to jump. I'm going to jump around a bit. We're not just going to do this chronologically. We all know who won the Russian Civil War. The Bolsheviks won it. Antony, do you think if the Whites had won it, would there have been a fascist Russia at that time?
I think that's probably pretty likely. I mean, it's one of those sort of what-if questions of history. But I don't think the Whites ever really stood a chance of winning. They were such an incompatible alliance, a mixture of centrist socialist revolutionaries, bright socialist revolutionaries, but above all dominated by reactionary officers from the Tsarist army, and then the extreme anti-Semitic Cossacks right across Siberia and into the northern Caucasus and most of the Caucasus. And this was, as I say, an incompatible alliance who could never really get themselves together. But also because they occupied the periphery, really, of Russia, and the Reds, in fact, had the central area. And this gave them, in what is called in military terms, the advantages of internal communications. That centralism gave them a huge bonus. But basically also, the Whites, and especially the Tsarist officers, were such obsessive imperialists that they irritated the Poles, the Finns, the Baltic states, all of whom could have supported them. But because of their imperialist obsession, they managed to exasperate them and, in fact, lose the opportunity of a sort of major anti-Bolshevik alliance.
We know what happened to the Tsar and his family during the Civil War. Was there ever any hope of a restoration or the use of the royal family as a banner?
Well, the interesting thing is, to what degree would the Tsar have represented a threat if they had lived? I think Lenin was determined, like many of the Bolsheviks, to make sure that the past was irrecoverable. That is one of the reasons why he supported the destruction of manor houses, of anything really to do with the past. It was, in a way, a cultural revolution as well as a political and a social one. But I don't think that the question was, which they were facing, was the Tsar and the imperial family more of a threat alive, or seen as, if you like, as martyrs if they were dead? And I don't think that they had enough support. In 1917, one saw, to almost an astonishing degree, how few officers were prepared to fight or resist the revolution of February 1917, and even, to a large degree, the October coup d'etat by the communists. So there was no real support.
So, just in a nutshell, 'cause I know this is an incredibly challenging request, Antony. Are you ready for this? Just tell us. We know that Lenin, and assisted by Trotsky and Stalin, seized power in Petrograd. He moved the capital to Moscow. Then intervention and the raising of white armies launched the Civil War. Can you just tell us, in a nutshell, what the hell happened next? Because it's very complicated, but not too long. But just give us an idea of white armies coming in, being defeated, other ones coming in from other directions, and the interventions.
Well, the people talk about the intervention. I mean, there were so many different armies involved. One of the key armies, in a way, was a strange development, and it was that the Czechoslovaks, who had, of course, been divided between the warring powers of the First World War, between the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russians, and the Germans, wanted to come together. Wanted to come together. So most of them crossed over the front lines to join up with their comrades on the Russian side. Trotsky made a huge, huge blunder because he threatened them when there was some trouble, and suddenly you have this Czechoslovak corps of troops who were well organized and well armed. And this created, in fact, what was the civil war right across Siberia. Without this particular clash, which Trotsky provoked unintentionally, there wouldn't necessarily have been much of a war in Siberia. The real battle really came from Denikin, General Denikin, a white general commanding in the south, and his troops, who were supported by the British, not with fighting troops, except for one RAF squadron, but above all was supported by a huge provision of guns, of uniforms, of ammunition, even hospitals, to help their, their resistance to the Red Army, led at that particular point by Trotsky. This is 1918.
My grandfather was one of those soldiers in the intervention. But anyway, one thing I wanted to ask you, I'm going to come to you in a minute, Luke, but one thing I wanted to ask you, Antony, was Trotsky, I mean, you mentioned a colossal blunder that Trotsky made. Was he the military genius of the Civil War? Did he deliver victory?
Well, Trotsky was a brilliant speaker. He could really raise the morale of the troops. And Trotsky would arrive in his armored train with even sort of, special troops because he loved moving from crisis to crisis. But he was not necessarily a strategic genius. To start with, he opposed the idea of cavalry, which he thought was old-fashioned and aristocratic. But even then, he suddenly found that actually, because of the sheer landmass, the sheer size of Russia, to begin with, it was a railway war and a cavalry war. So eventually you find this wonderful, these posters, which the Red Army was putting up saying, "Proletarians to horse." Then they realized that actually they had to reorganize the Red Army from an amateur basis onto a much more professional one. And Trotsky was very much behind that. This was opposed, of course, by Stalin, as Sebag would know any too well, and was in a way part of this original great hatred between the two men. But the real thing was that once they started to get their act together, the Reds were much more effective in the way that they would win over, even though they were often hated by the peasantry for the way that they were taking their food for the cities, they were still hated less than the whites.
There's a famous quote by Napoleon who said that generalship, like prostitution, is one of the professions where the professional is often less good than the amateur.
Absolutely. And also Napoleon also said, do not interrupt the enemy when he's making a mistake.
Great one. There are amazing characters during this war, which we're going to come to in a minute. There are also some astonishing monsters, which we're also going to visit. I said already that Ukraine was the crucible of hell during this war, and much of that hell was, part of that hell was anti-Semitic pogroms going on with under Ukrainian warlords. Before I come to Antony to ask what actually happened, Luke, I'm going to come to you. You're there now. The figures of Simon Petlira and Makhno and other leaders are very controversial in Ukraine now. Tell me a little bit about how people like Petlira is regarded in Ukraine, because this is an important part of the sort of political fight today.
Yeah, I mean, Petlura was a Ukrainian nationalist leader who swept in to Kiev during this period. And actually, interestingly, I mean, we're talking about non-fiction books today, but when I was in Kiev last year, I was reading The White Guard by Mikhail Bulgakov, which is all about this. And it's full of kind of ironies, because he was, Petlura's forces swept into Kiev in the same way that Russian tanks rolled in from the north and the northwest through these garden suburbs, pine forests, snow. It was the same direction. And certainly Bulgakov's view was that Petlura was an anti-Semite, was a nationalist, and was someone who represented these kind of dark, inchoate peasant forces who were tearing apart Kiev and bringing disorder and ruin. I mean, that was his view. I mean, I think this conversation is just very complicated, because on the one hand, I'd be interested to see what Antony thinks about this, but Petlura, certainly his supporters were anti-Semitic. On the other hand, the idea that the Ukrainians are all Nazis, nationalists, anti-Semites is a kind of Soviet trope that Vladimir Putin and his propagandists have sort of instrumentalized to justify their invasion. I mean, I suppose the brief version is history is complicated.
That's right. I mean, that's why this book is very important to read, and an essential reading today. So, Antony, tell us what really happened with Petlura. You tell it very well in the book.
Well, Petlura,
who was he?
In December of 1917, 1918, the opportunity, if you like, for the Ukrainian nationalists was there to try to take over. And they didn't last very long, because that they had very few troops, but there was chaos in Kiev at that particular time when they moved in. But then there was a whole, when I say an army, I mean, in fact, it only had about 2,000 men under Muravyev, who were the Reds moving in, and they pushed out the Ukrainian nationalists. So the Ukrainian nationalists had very little control over Kiev during that particular time. They were either pushed out by the Whites or pushed out by the Reds, and it didn't last for very long. But overall, it's been estimated that up to 150,000 Jews were killed during the course of the Civil War, but by both sides. In fact, you could say by all three sides, when you talk about the independent Ukrainian warlords like Grigoriev or Makhno and so forth, who were definitely anti-Semitic. Though Makhno did have quite a few Jews in his forces, there was no doubt about it. But I mean, these things were never simple. History is never tidy, I'm afraid.
That's right. I mean, I think an interesting thing, just to move on from Ukraine itself, is I would regard as a hero of the Russian Civil War, and there aren't many, is Pilsudski, Marshal Pilsudski of Poland, who said, an independent Poland is impossible without an independent Ukraine.
Yes.
Which is a very thing. Could you just explain to us, Antony, how Poland stopped the Soviet invasion of Europe?
Well, the Battle of Warsaw, or the Battle of the Vistula, which took place in 1920, was all part of the Soviet-Polish War. I don't think the Poles would appreciate by saying it was part of the Russian Civil War necessarily, because as far as they were concerned, it was their greatest moment. And they feel that they saved Europe from international Bolshevism. There's no doubt about it. In 1920, the Poles were preparing themselves. They had advanced all the way to Kiev. They promised independence to the Ukrainians and to Petlura. Others suspected them of using that as almost as a cloak for taking over Ukraine. That was not, I don't think that's true, and I agree entirely with Sebag on that. But the key thing was that by this extraordinary, one of the great sort of tactical movements of history, the Polish army, and above all the Polish cavalry, managed to surprise the Reds as they thought they were about to conquer Warsaw and then move on into Germany and right across Europe. And the Red Army got a very bloody nose, and in fact was forced into a humiliating retreat. Many of them had to actually flee into East Prussia and surrender their weapons. So it was, as many have decided or described, one of the decisive victories in the whole of history.
Yeah, because I mean, Lenin was hoping to advance into Poland, and their real target was Germany.
Yes.
And you know, Lenin's motto was "Probe with bayonets. If you find mush, probe further." Yeah. So that was one of the decisive battles of modern times, and the war was full of fascinating characters, which Antony describes brilliantly. To jump far away from Ukraine and Europe altogether, let's go to the Far East, Antony. And will you introduce us to one of the most diabolical lunatics ever to fight in battle, and describe the character and excesses of a man who thought that he was Genghis Khan reincarnated, Baron Roman von Ungern-Sternberg?
I'm afraid that any civil war, but above all the Russian Civil War, brings sociopaths, psychopaths, sadists of the worst order right to the top. And there's no doubt about it that Ungern-Sternberg, who was a brilliant man in certain ways, you know, he was he had renounced, shall we say, all Western aspects. He'd gone, became a Buddhist, and but it was at the same time prepared, you know, to inflict the most appalling cruelties in every direction. And he was not alone. I mean, there were other Cossack leaders who were equally as bad. And I'm afraid, you know, that, as I say, this sort of atmosphere gave an opportunity to leaders who basically should never have been let out of a cage.
But one of the fascinating things about the war is that though they lost Poland and Finland and they failed to invade Western Europe, but they did get their first Soviet satellite in the Far East, Mongolia.
Yes.
How did that come about, Antony?
Well, partly it came about because Ungern-Sternberg and his lot basically thought that they could take over Mongolia, and I think that he had fantasies of being made almost the equivalent of sort of king of Mongolia or some sort of ruling figure. But in fact, this actually forced the Red Army and, if you like, the Presidium in Moscow to really make an effort of sending the whole of the Red Sixth Army into Mongolia so as to eliminate that. And this was, as Sebag says, you know, this was the first satellite state which they established. But one must also remember what was going on in the Far East, in the sense that the Japanese, who later took over what they called Manchukuo, but was Manchuria, in the 1930s, they already had ambitions in their idea of basically Lebensraum, of living room, of basically colonizing the Far East. And they basically had altogether at one point had actually sent as many as 80,000 troops into the Far East. And the reason why the Americans sent a division was to keep an eye on the Japanese, because the Americans realized, well, you know, Japan as a rising power was a distinct danger and threat. And this is something that we will see much later in the 1930s and then the Second World War.
The sequel to the Bolshevik victory in the Civil War was the creation of a new state structure, which is very relevant today. And before we get to questions, which are quite soon, let's just talk about how the Civil War ended and how Lenin and Stalin redesigned. We've already mentioned it a little bit about Putin blaming Lenin for giving Ukraine a sort of independent structure. Antony, you do this very well in the book. It's quite complicated, but it's very important. How did Lenin and Stalin create the Soviet Union in 1922? The structure.
The structure, in a way, was much more one of trying to, if you like, unify the many different, when I say unify, shall we say, control the many different nationalities. And this is why Stalin, as a Georgian, was picked, if you like, as the commissar, the People's Commissar for the nationalities. Stalin, of course, knew perfectly well that he was not interested in any sense of allowing a real independence of the nationalities. The whole point was to give an impressive overview of a unified Soviet state. I mean, what we have to realize when one's talking about Russia, and especially about Russians today, is one cannot generalize. I mean, there is no DNA to any country, and certainly not a country like Russia, which has so many different nationalities and so many different aspects. But what they were trying to do was to create, if you like, a Soviet unity. And this was the whole idea, rather as they had in 1917 when we were talking about the problem of self-determination. They basically wanted to integrate everything together, but of course under Soviet control, under Soviet leadership and command.
I mean, the idea was that it looked like they were independent states.
Exactly.
But a bit like the Hotel California, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave.
Yes.
But then they did. So, Luke, I mean, just jump ahead now a century to what happened in 1991 when the states did become independent.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting you sort of look at why Russia has done this, and you look at Putin's, the invasion, I mean, of last year, Putin's sort of brooding obsession with Ukraine, and I do think swirling around is a sense that it was actually the Ukrainian Socialist Republic that dealt the death blow to the Soviet Union in 1991 by voting to break away and for independence overwhelmingly, including, it has to be said, in Crimea, which voted for independence as well. And there's a sort of sense for Putin that this is unfinished business. And also it's very interesting to kind of Antony, that there's a real ideological incoherency about the history of now, about what Russia is doing now, because actually, you know, as Antony was saying, this essay that Putin wrote in the summer of 1921, he explicitly blames Lenin for creating Ukraine, says it's a fiction, it was never a state, this is historical Russian land that he has to redeem. And at the same time, when I've been traveling around Ukraine, in areas occupied by Russia where Lenin statues were toppled by kind of pro-European Ukrainians, pro-Western Ukrainians after 2014, after Putin's annexation of Crimea. Lenin has been going back up again. There's been a process of re-Leninization. So the villain becomes the hero. It's been very strange the way that the Putin regime appropriates, it's like sort of bricolage, different parts of Russian history, but has also very much been channeling the whole kind of white imperial legacy in recent years.
Stealing the body of Prince Potemkin.
And stealing the body of Prince Potemkin, most recently in the city of Kharkiv. Yeah, they took Kherson, they took his bones across the Dnieper River. I don't know where Prince Potemkin is now.
Prince Potemkin is lost. But I think the point is that repeatedly in Russian history, the rulers from Peter the Great to Nicholas II to Lenin to Putin have believed that the Russian state cannot exist without Ukraine.
Yeah. I mean, definitely Ukraine is essential, and this is one thing I try and kind of look at in my book in invasion. I mean, Putin's reason for invading Ukraine is preposterous. He says he wants to denazify the country and demilitarize it, but I actually think that the greater threat, I mean, it's also a civilizational war as he sees it against the West, but it is really example. I mean, if Ukraine can be a successful, prosperous European country of 40 million people, full of Russian speakers, which is transparent and integrated with Western structures, then why can't Russia? Why can't Russia? And of course, he doesn't want that to happen, and therefore he has to crush Ukraine and to bring it back under his dominion.
Let me, we're going to come to questions now. But if I forget to say at the end, Antony Beevor, and as well as Luke and I, will all be signing copies of our books afterwards. And I cannot recommend Antony Beevor's latest enough. It's essential reading, as is Luke's. Now, if there's any questions, now is a good time to ask them. And if you don't, we'll just talk more among ourselves. Right.
On the right?
Yeah, on the right. I think there's a... Yes.
Thank you. Love the session, by the way. Favorite one. So I would like to ask, what was the motivating factor between the soldiers of the Russian Civil War? Why did they join, or were they drafted? Was there a reason for them to join, like a national identity over reclaiming Russia or something?
Good question. That's for you, Antony.
In most cases, they literally had no choice. Some were ideologically motivated, who believed in, shall we say, the communist ideals on one side. On the side of the whites, those who did join voluntarily tended to be ones who, out of resentment at the loss of their farms or their properties or the destruction of their manor houses, they were fighting back out of resentment. And this is where one sees the difference really between the two sides and why, in fact, the Reds had better support on balance, especially amongst the peasantry. But one has to remember that the vast majority of their forces, both Reds and Whites, came from the prisoners they captured in a battle. They simply said, right, okay, you've just been fighting for the Reds, you're now fighting for us, or vice versa. So, shall we say, in most cases, it was compulsion rather than idealism.
Okay, gentleman here with his hand up right there in the red shirt.
Hi, thank you for the session. I think I just want to ask a question on the invasion of Ukraine and like Putin's motivation. So obviously in the news we've seen like a lot of factors, as you just said, the historical essay he mentioned, which he believed Ukraine's lands were Russian. Then the fact that NATO was setting up a lot of stuff along the border. Then there's also these other theories that his 70th birthday was on 7th October 2022, and he wanted to leave behind a legacy of himself as a Tsar. So I think one answer we could obviously give is it's like a mixture of every reason. But if like as experts in the field, if you had to pick like one main reason for invading Ukraine, what would that be?
I blame history. I think historians can sometimes be dangerous. I don't know if you agree, but amateur historians can be very dangerous. And Putin has become increasingly isolated. I mean, he's effectively a dictator of Russia. He's been in power for well over 2 decades. And we all had a bad time during COVID, but he had an especially bad and paranoid time where he spent 2 years entirely isolated, apart from a handful of people, calling up books and papers, reading essays by people like Solzhenitsyn, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who's the kind of bridge between Soviet and post-Soviet thinking and some of Putin's imperial ideas. And I think he also, you mentioned his birthday, he's 70 years old. There have been rumors that he's been in poor health. We don't know if they're true because everything about the Kremlin is secret, as it was in Soviet times. But I think he decided that this great task could not be left to any successor of reuniting what he regards as historical Russian lands. And what's interesting, just briefly, is that the Americans and the British were kind of saying very emphatically he was going to invade, and a lot of people could not believe it, that someone who really was obsessed with his place in history would do such a foolish and strategically stupid thing. And he did. And I think that Putin, in his twilight years, I think we're towards the end of Putin, is just thinking about his place in history, thinking about some of the people that Simon writes about so well, about how he matches up with Ivan the Terrible, with Peter the Great, with Stalin, and so on. And it's a kind of it's an old man's delusion, unfortunately, and that is where we are.
I mean, apparently when he meets historians, he always says, "How will you remember me?" And also, there's accounts of him saying, I'm never going to abdicate. And he uses the word abdicate. Antony, how do you see this important question?
Well, I mean, one of the bizarre paradoxes in a way is that Putin's ideology, his view of this sort of holy, sacred, Slavic, Orthodox state, which should be extended all the way, as Dugan, who was one of the other ideologues, said, from Vladivostok to Dublin. This does not come from the Soviet side, this comes from the white side. The ideology on which Putin's whole idea is based actually comes from the white exiles who were defeated in the Russian Civil War. So again, it's one of many paradoxes. You see with all of the double-headed eagles, both in the Kremlin and the statues of czars, there's hardly any monument, in fact, left to the Soviet Union, which is one of the, as I say, one of the paradoxes of the reign.
Let's move on to another question. I see someone right at the very back. Yes, you in a leather jacket, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. And then we'll take other people. Let me see who else. Just raise your hands.
And then over on the right, there are quite a few.
Okay, and then over on the right, we'll come to you. We'll come to you next. Okay, I was thinking of that lady over there. But okay, no, you ask your question. You ask your question, sir. And then we'll.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Thank you. Two quick questions. I think there's a topic not talked enough. Could you clarify the US's involvement with the whites? That's kind of unclear. And is the second question, is there still a nostalgia for the czars in Russia?
We can answer that quite. Not much is the answer. Not much. But there is a fusion. But Putin is kind of channeling both the Romanov ethos and Stalin as well into a sort of his own rather poisonous brew. But let's just have the question at the back as well. And then we're going to move to this area in a second.
My question is, if Mr. Putin is unsuccessful with his ambitions in Ukraine, do you think he'll turn his eye to another former USSR country afterwards?
Yeah.
I think briefly, it's a rolling program. And if he prevails in Ukraine, I think it would be wrong to assume that he would stop. I mean, there are other countries on his shopping list, if you can call it that. I mean, certainly Moldova, there's a strip of sort of post-Soviet territory, a breakaway part of Moldova called Transnistria, which has got Russian troops in it already, just west of Odessa. I mean, he would like to link up with that. And then I think he'd very much like to do the Baltics. Particularly, there's Kaliningrad, this exclave left over from the Second World War, which is formerly part of the Russian Federation, but is separated. And I think he would like to build a land corridor to Kaliningrad. And also, he really hates the Poles. He loathes the Poles. He would love to smash the Poles in the face. And actually, recently, you just look at Russian state TV, which I do from time to time. They're talking about redividing Germany, that the reunification of Germany was a mistake. Berlin needs to be taught a lesson. And also talking about nuking London.
And also, they are Russianizing Georgia again in the Caucasus.
I mean, and Georgia is being slowly reabsorbed as a client state.
Antony, would you like to say something, or shall I move on?
I think let's move on to...
Let's move on to... There are a lot of questions there. Could we have several questions together, because we're going to run out of time otherwise? Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi. See, the West pretty much won the Cold War in 1991. So what was the need to then expand the NATO right up to Russia's borders? And, it's like poking a sleeping bear.
I'm going to take other questions as well. Keep going.
Yeah, and don't you also think there is some Western hypocrisy at play? Any worse or better than the Western invasion of Iraq in 2003?
You better take that now.
I mean, briefly, it's possible for different countries to do bad things at different times, and I think it's a kind of race to the bottom if you say, look, you invaded Iraq, and therefore, the invasion of Ukraine is okay. I mean, these things are not okay at all, and Ukraine is a horror show. Tens of thousands of people have been killed, civilians, women, children, and so on. There's no way of really post-justifying it. On NATO, all I would say was that actually, countries have agency. You know, India has agency. India has elections. The Baltic states, occupied after the Second World War by the Soviet Union, are understandably nervous, and the people voted. Those people voted to join NATO, and really, Putin began this war. I'm afraid, no one else.
Okay, sorry, Antony, would you like to say something there?
No. I think that this is absolutely essential to understand that NATO expanded because these countries wanted to join NATO, and they have the right, as sovereign countries, to join whatever alliance they wanted to. Now, there were one or two moments when, in fact, NATO should have actually sort of cooled things down, it's true. But to say that it was NATO who deliberately advanced to Russian borders is actually getting things the wrong way around.
Okay, let's do some questions. There's three people there. Can I have all three questions? First this lady, then the gentleman, and then the gentleman in front.
Yeah, my question is, Sebag, you asked, had the whites won, there would have been, like, you know, the whole fascist ruling. Would it have been really different had the fascists won, the state of Russian society, the gulags, the concentration camps, which essentially happened? Would it have been really different had the fascists come in instead of the Bolsheviks?
Okay, good question. Let's have the next one, please. The gentleman next to you.
First of all, thank you for the enlightening and informative session. I wanted to ask how consequential was the role of Rasputin in the ultimate incompetency of Tsar Nicholas, because he has made terrible decisions throughout his ruling period. How consequential was he?
That's a great question. And the third one of the, yes, trying to remember.
Sorry, it's a simple question. What could Ukraine had done to avoid this war? I know it's a bit of a devil's advocate, and you're already harped on how bad Putin is, but that's my question.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of to start this off, I mean, I think one's got to remember that what we're forgetting in all these great power movements and aspirations is the Ukrainian people had a choice themselves, and that's been the decisive thing in this. The Ukrainian people's wish to live in an independent, democratic country. So let's take the first question, Luke.
I mean, I think they could have done nothing. Actually, I mean, Putin made a series of kind of demands about NATO rolling back from Central and Eastern Europe, but in essence, I think he decided really in the spring of 2021 to do a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and there was nothing which would have deflected him. And actually, to be fair to the international community, I don't always agree with Western leaders. They did try. I mean, Macron and others went to see Putin to try and persuade him not to do this. But he has a sort of shimmering vision before him, which is not today or tomorrow. It's sort of hundreds, thousands of years in his place in history, and he was not going to be deflected.
Anthony, would you like to contribute to these questions?
On Ukraine, you mean, on
yes.
whatever? Yes, I mean, if Ukraine was going to avoid invasion, it would have had to have more or less surrendered to Putin and done exactly what he said. But the whole idea that Ukraine should follow a pro-European rather than a pro-Russian course of development was seen almost as a betrayal by Putin, which he was not going to allow under any circumstances.
Right, we're going to finish with Rasputin appropriately, and I think with Rasputin, I think the answer about Rasputin is that Rasputin is one of those amazing characters who gather a legend of mystery and mysticism. In fact, he was simply Russia's last imperial favorite. Russian leaders often pick very talented favorites, and that reflected talented czars. Untalented czars appointed very untalented favorites, and one of the least talented was Rasputin himself. And though he was blamed for the decisions that were made by Nicholas II and Alexander, the truth of the matter was that it was their decisions. They were responsible for them, and they kept making very foolish decisions even after Rasputin was killed. Yes. So I think in many ways Rasputin has been wronged in all of this. Antony, do you agree with that?
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, there was no doubt about it. I mean, Rasputin, by using his influence on the Tsarina, did contribute to terrible corruption in terms of appointments, senior appointments in the Russian government. Of that, there's no doubt. And he, of course, was also responsible for the Tsar taking over command of the armies in 1915, which was totally disastrous. And, of course, basically focused the blame for the disastrous course of the war on the imperial family itself. So he definitely contributed very much to the downfall of the Romanovs.
Brilliant. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having us. And Antony Beevor will be signing books in the wherever we go and sign books, and all three of us will be there assisting him.
We would like to thank Antony Beevor, Luke Harding, and Simon Sebag Montefiore for this lovely session. Ladies and gentlemen, a huge round of applause to our speakers. Antony Beevor and Luke Harding and Simon Sebag will be signing books on my right at the kiosk. You can grab your copies from Full Circle right at the back. Please subscribe to Jaipur Literature Festival YouTube channel to access all the sessions. And we'd love to hear from you on our social media, so please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2023 and tag at Jaipur Literature Fest. We'll begin with the next session shortly.